technology problems. Welcome back to Penn's workshop in the history of material text. I'm Zachary Lesser, professor of English, one of the co-organizers of the seminar, along with Jerry Singerman, editor emeritus at the press, John Pollock, curator in the Kislak Center, and Eileen Malcolm, who's the Brisdell Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Text. She's also going to manage the Zoom as usual. So at the end, if you're joining us via Zoom, of course, you're welcome to participate in Q&A, and you can use the raise hand function, and we'll ask you to unmute, and you can ask your question live. As we usually say, we're now in our, and then we have to check the archives, but we are in our 29th year of weekly meetings. As a reminder, you can find a searchable database of talks going back to 1996 on our website, pennmaterialtext.com. The contents of the first 3 years of talks are apparently lost, as they were announced in the pre-listserv era via paper ephemera. But maybe one of you has some information somewhere on who spoke when about what, and if you do, let us know. On our website also, if you're joining us for the first time, you can sign up for our listserv if you're not on it yet. There should be a sign-in sheet going around the room. Please do sign in on that and let us know if you want to be added to the listserv. You'll just get one email or so a week. You won't get bombarded. And last announcement from me anyway, next Monday, we'll welcome Ashish Kapoor Siddiq of UMass, who will talk about the US Constitution as part of our mini theme this semester on foundational documents. And you can see past talks from last year and this semester on our YouTube channel. So I'm really pleased that Professor Elizabeth McHenry is speaking to us tonight. She's someone we've been wanting to host for a while now. She's professor of English at NYU and is currently serving as chair of the department. After earning her BA from Columbia, she went on to a PhD at Stanford. Professor McHenry is one of the leading scholars in the fields of book history and African-American literature, and her work on the intersection of those areas has been truly groundbreaking. Her first book was Forgotten Readers, Recovering the Lost History of African-American Literary Societies, published by Duke in 2002. Here she traced the history of Black literary associations, literacy groups, and book clubs in the decades between the Civil War and World War II. And she shows how these institutions offered an important forum for assertions of African-American civic identity, agency, and power. Among much else, it's a remarkable work of archival reconstruction. As Henry Louis Gates wrote, most of us had presumed these records to be lost or non-existent. Through meticulous research, McHenry has managed to reconstruct the nature and function of these curious arenas of literary culture in splendid detail. My favorite review, though, is from Carla Holloway. This book is for all those people who thought book clubs began with Oprah. Her new book is just out, right about now from Duke, and it's available for only $27.95 in paperback. It's called To Make Negro Literature, Writing, Literary Practice, and African-American Authorship, and it promises to be a major rethinking of the category of authorship as it examines a series of failed, less than successful, or to use a keyword for the book, unsettled projects in African-American literature, and I'm excited to read it. And I'm excited to hear our talk tonight on race publishing, subscription books, and Black communities. As always, we'll have plenty of time for discussion. And we have some related items, both from the Kislak Center and from Elizabeth's own collection on the table. So you should feel free to check those out during and after Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Professor McHenry.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. I just want to say a special thank you to John Pollock and Lynn Farrington, who's not here tonight. But deep in the spring of 2020, when I was trying to get this manuscript off to the press in the middle of a pandemic, I don't even know how you did it, but they sent me like the TIFF files that I needed from the collection. So it was really super appreciated. Let me share my screen. And I'll start, oh my gosh, there's a lot up here. I'll start right away because I know we're a little bit late. Does that look right? Okay, hopefully this is good. At the heart of tonight's talk is a fundamental question. How do we know literary history? This is the question that animated my last book project, in which I tried to approach on a granular level what appeared to me as a critically understudied and underappreciated timeframe in Black literary history, the years surrounding the turn from the 19th to the 20th century. These years are most commonly known for the work of three writers whose success in the literary marketplace ensured their visibility would be lasting: the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, the novelist Charles Chesnutt, and the educator Booker T. Washington. By lingering on the interval between 1895 and 1910, I sought to think more carefully about the kinds of writing and literary work, the spaces where literary culture was advanced and practiced, and the modes of authorship and the kinds of publishing opportunities that coexisted with these most visible signs of literary accomplishment. What began to emerge, I ineloquently began to think of as literary attempts, texts, genres, institutions, and modes of authorship that have gone unseen or unrecognized, that we have dismissed as unsuccessful, unproductive, unconventional, anomalous, or irrelevant. My inquiry into these critically unappreciated and under-theorized aspects of Black print culture became To Write Negro Literature, a book that contends that the complexity and fundamental unsettledness of turn-of-the-century African-American literary culture needs to be revisited so that we may read the stories of lesser-known and uncelebrated authors, messier and unpublished texts, and unsuccessful or under-realized projects alongside and against those deemed successful and those that have received substantial critical attention. Materials of the sort I examine in the book demand close reading and critical analysis, I argue, for the simple reason that they broaden and complicate what is often perceived as a seamless march through published texts and conventional modes of authorship from the past to the present. In the faltering efforts, the failed strategies, the instability and the discontinuity that make up to make Negro literature, that are part of to make Negro literature, they bring to the fore an important genealogy of African-American literary culture that pushes us to expand our analytical rubrics, our critical frames of reference, and the objects of attention that we give to literary study in important ways. The book then is an experiment in what it would mean to take seriously a set of materials and interventions that laid practical and conceptual groundwork for what we now think of as African-American literature, most of which are not lost or even particularly hidden, but rather disregarded. Books sold by subscription to African-Americans across the turn of the century are prime examples of such materials, these ones that are neither lost nor particularly hidden, but rather disregarded. I first stumbled across these books on a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard University. It was the titles of the books that first caught my attention: 20th Century Negro Literature, Progress of a Race, The Afro-American Encyclopedia, A New Negro for a New Century. How could they not hold a place, I thought, in African-American literary history? But I could never figure out what that place was. Part of the reason for this was my own short-sightedness. I had grown accustomed to the most visible kinds of literary texts and markers of literary culture, texts, authors, and practices that, from the early 19th century, were deeply embedded in the educational opportunities and social networks associated with the Black middle and upper classes of the urban North. Another reason for this, and I hate to admit it, is because I could not bring myself to actually read the books. They bored me to tears. I found the covers to be beautiful and some of the images, like this one of the Statue of Liberty holding aloft a book where her beckoning, welcoming flame should have been, powerful and intellectually intriguing. But beyond this, the books were disappointing. They struck me as tedious and uninspiring. Covering a huge array of information, I didn't even know what to call them. And they offered little in the way of direction on how I might begin to recover their history. So my talk tonight will focus on one representative text, and that's Progress of a Race, which is published in 1898. But it's also about the practice of research and about how projects unfold, not only across time, but also across different contexts. In what follows, I've tried to show some of my roots into these cheaply produced and apparently worthless books as a way to illuminate how I came to recognize them as a lens through which to see one of the ways that literacy and skills associated with the literary were extended, developed, and practiced and supported across the South and the Midwest in communities of Black people who were generally less privileged, less well-educated, and less likely to have access to the sort of organized literary activities and periodicals from which we have drawn most of our understanding of African-American literary culture. And some of that understanding has come from my own work. And so in some way, this project or this part of the project sort of rectifies what I didn't do in my first book. To make sense of these texts, I had to open them and read them. But I also had to appreciate the distinctly pedagogical logic of the books, where they fit into the landscape of Black education, and the manner in which they were produced, marketed, and sold. Okay, so this first section is called a pedagogical logic. So Progress of the Race bears the names of two authors. The first is William Krogman, and this is Krogman you're looking at on the screen. And then the other is Henry Frick Klietzing. Let me bracket Klietzing for the moment, whose association with this volume, along with the subject of authorship generally, in a text that is made up of bits and snippets of texts authored by others, and then loosely woven together by an editorial voice, I can return to in the question and answer. An African-American professor of Greek and Latin at Atlanta's Clark University, Krogman was an early practitioner of what we might now think of as the public humanities. Education, he believed, must move Black people from what he termed the little world of school to the larger world of action and responsibility. He was an important, if understudied, participant in protests surrounding the lack of Black representation at Chicago's World's Fair in 1893. In 1894, he was appointed as one of 14 Black men charged with ensuring that the 1895 World's Fair, held in Atlanta, yielded what Chicago's had not: a Negro building, a dedicated space and site for Black representation. Much of our understanding of the Negro building has been overshadowed by Booker T. Washington's speech at the Atlanta Exposition, in which Washington urged African Americans to focus on agriculture, the mechanical arts, and domestic service, while remaining subservient and politically inactive. The Negro building, however, neither supported nor rejected this perspective. In the diversity of the Negro building's exhibits and its programming, which included speeches, caucuses, debates, and conferences, and various other kinds of programming, lay a pedagogic logic. Visitors to the Negro building saw displays of Black manufacturing alongside the work of Black artists, and college students and business leaders and civic organizers. Public forums invited discussions on the relationship between Africa and African Americans, and Congresses launched organizational efforts around women's work, the Black press, and various professional identities. A conference on the Black soldier highlighted military efforts of Black troops, and in doing so, shared knowledge about the centrality of Black patriots to the nation's most important national narratives. More than anything else, I came to understand, Krogman and the other commissioners from the Negro building created a place of Black study. It served as a generative intellectual workspace in which Black fairgoers practiced and performed as critical thinkers, taking on the most pressing and the most complex issues of racial identity, national belonging, and American race relations. So the Atlanta Exposition closed on December 31st of 1895. The historical record leaves little to help us trace Krogman's actual process or his intent in putting Progress of a Race together. But in the years that followed, when the bricks and mortar building that housed the Negro building had been emptied of its contents, Krogman appears to have used Progress of a Race to create the pedagogical logic of the Negro building in textual form. Copyrighted just 2 years after the close of the Atlanta Exposition, Progress of a Race replicated the Negro building as an instructional space, relocating it from the temporary public and architectural space of the Negro building to the permanent, domestic, and mobile site of the book. The development I trace here from building to book seems inevitable, since the designers of these exhibitions, like the Negro building, sometimes use the format of a book as their pattern. Writing several years later about the 1900 Paris Exposition, African-American lawyer Thomas Calloway saw how such exhibitions were already books in potentia. He would note that the organizers decided, and I quote, decided to make the exhibition a social study and to constitute each feature as a supplementary chapter, the whole forming a book or treatise on Negro progress and present conditions. This brings into perspective the way that the book Progress of a Race was perhaps modeled after the programs and exhibits of the Atlanta Exposition's Negro building. Like the Negro building, exposure to the text's curated materials was food for thought, creating a forum for intellectual engagement and debate, and providing both a context and an organized structure for learning. Okay, so the next part of my talk is called self-education. What's interesting to note is that the contents of Progress of a Race and books like it, and the pedagogical practices they supported, largely defied the tenets of the two models of Black education that we commonly associate with the turn from the 19th to the 20th century. The industrial or vocational model of education that was most widely available to African Americans at the end of the 19th century may have supported basic literacy, but it did not advance the more complex and layered learning and critical engagement associated with the literary. That is, both a wider and deeper experience with reading and the critical methods for studying, evaluating, and interpreting a wide body of writing. Progress of a Race and books like it provided the material with which to do this. The books also significantly extended the liberal arts education offered to what was a very small fraction of the Black population in Negro colleges and universities, and it extended what was offered beyond these institutions. And it added Black history and culture as a necessary and legitimate subject of study. In both instances, then, we might think of these books as supporting areas of study that were not available in the educational institutions open to African Americans at the end of the 19th century. It is not only, though, that books sold by subscription at this time offered a different kind of education. They also reinforce our understanding of the ways that Black people relied throughout the 19th century on different sites of education. The one-room schoolhouse in which the formerly enslaved gathered in enormous numbers to be educated after the Civil War was one of the most familiar images from the 19th century. And indeed, these sprung up across the South after the Civil War. But alongside of this is a story of African-American self-education. That is, learning that does not take place in the context of a formal institution or site of learning. And that begins before the Civil War in books like Benjamin Banneker's Almanac, which is published annually from 1791 to 1802, or James Pennington's A Textbook on the Origins and History, et cetera, of the Colored People, which was published in 1841. As I have argued elsewhere, the earliest African-American newspapers, such as Freedom's Journal and the Colored American, understood themselves to be makeshift textbooks. But this phenomenon in which a text replicates the task we might conventionally think of as housed in a school is perhaps most easily visible in the Freedmen's Torchlight, a newspaper published in Brooklyn, New York in 1866. The newspaper's creators meant for it to be distributed monthly among the formerly enslaved in the South as both a substitute for and supplement to formal schooling. Adult readers of the Freedmen's Torchlight were to be seen as its primary audience. We could not attend school in our youthful days, they were told. And now we cannot spare a day for school. Yet we must learn how to read and write and understand figures. The newspaper was itself a solution to this dilemma. It told its readers, order your children to prepare for school and proceed to work. For adults, and I quote, without a knowledge of letters, the newspaper would provide instructional material that would take the place of formal teacher-led classrooms. One of the things Freedmen's Torchlight illustrates is how, for Black Americans, books became their own school. Another is how school books, in whatever form they take, gave sequence to instruction. You can see how Freedom's Torchlight moves its students forward from an elementary curriculum, a listing of the alphabet in both lower and uppercase letters, to simple combinations of vowels and consonants and spelling and reading lessons, which transition readers from cat, dog, the, and see to more complicated words and sentences. Even more interesting is the way in which these lessons led to other lessons, both within this issue of the paper and in future issues. Readers interested in English grammar, for instance, were directed to another place in the Torchlight, and those pursuing knowledge of geography likewise to another place in this little paper. For those interested in prosody, what they called the fourth and last part of grammar, however, the newspaper promised it was a subject of which we will speak in due time. As a school book, in other words, it directed readers to different classrooms and sometimes to future classes. Progress of Erase also functioned as a school book, not only in terms of helping its readers practice basic literacy, but also by helping them to extend it. In my work with subscription books, I linger over the fact that the acquisition of literacy was a long, difficult, and uneven process, one that may have begun in schoolhouses, but was extended, particularly across the South and in the Midwest, in the literary habits and practices that developed outside of schools. Through books like Progress of Erase, African Americans moved beyond the most basic literacy skills to embrace what was, at the end of the 19th century, an emergent idea of the literary. By supporting a wide variety of reading levels and levels of literary engagement, books like Progress of Erase helped to move readers forward, from reading pictures to reading short excerpts from texts to reading longer and more advanced texts that required a more sophisticated level of engagement and more advanced analytical, critical, and interpretive skills. Books like Progress of Erase, I argue, contributed to the rise of a broader understanding of reading accomplishment and of the purposes and possibilities of literature. In thinking of Progress of Erase and texts like it as school books, I was able to rethink some of their most curious and, frankly, their most tedious aspects, including their lack of originality and creativity. School books do not have to be original, creative, or new. They only need to contain useful knowledge that is well organized, effectively presented, and easily circulated. These are precisely the qualities of Progress of Erase. Its authors chopped up and blended texts together in order to make them accessible to a wide range of readers and to expose readers to a wide range of texts and ideas. References to Professor Johnson in his school history, for instance, or What Dr. Livingstone Says, are not intended to help readers locate the origins of a text, but to add authority and weight to the information, which helped readers learn how to consider and value ideas. The authors exposed readers to writers that were, quote, not friendly to the Negro, as well as to, and I quote, preposterous ideas, because however preposterous, these ideas were in circulation and they made a tremendous impact. They could only be successfully refuted and dismissed if they were understood. The authors inserted boldface headings and subheadings into texts written by others as a way to clarify the outline of writing and guide their readers to and through discrete units of text, often using headings to announce the subject of every paragraph. They did this because this sort of guidance was something that Black readers wanted and what some readers needed. In the words of one late 19th century reader, a book with short and clearly marked sections was most effective for a people who do not have complete control over their time. Indeed, one of the main arguments inherent in the construction of Progress of a Race was that racial knowledge and the ability to process texts could be made accessible. Let me start again. One of the main arguments inherent in the construction of Progress of Race was that racial knowledge and the ability to understand literary texts could be made accessible to all Black men and women, regardless of their distance from the pursuits traditionally associated with Black intellectualism at the end of the 19th century. By producing multiple perspectives and layers of information, the authors designed a text that would supply information on the history of Africa, for instance, or on Black literary figures. But it would also lead them to practice the critical and interpretive skills that were necessary to effectively interpret and evaluate them. One of the pedagogical imperatives of Progress of a Race is to show Black readers how to progress from literacy to the literary, from learning how to read to learning how to think critically, to learning how to represent oneself, which is exemplified in the movement from reading pictures to reading bits of condensed prose by anonymous authors, to reading long essays that expose Black readers to the thinking of the most prominent and most widely respected Black intellectuals. Let me move forward. And this is the part you've all been waiting for in some sense, because this is about the book's mobility. And this section is called A Race Publisher. So let me finally turn to what is arguably the most interesting feature of Progress of a Race, and that is its mobility. It's important to realize that this book, Progress of a Race, was part of a carefully calculated experiment, the story of which is embedded in the larger history of subscription publishing in the United States. Krogman may have been passionate about public educational work and intent on extending the pedagogical value of the Negro building. But Progress of a Race was a commercial venture undertaken by its Midwestern publisher, the Nichols Company, because the company believed in the book's potential to make money. Its success would be measured in its ability to reach an as yet untapped book buying public that the publisher calculated was eager to see themselves in print and to gain more and different perspectives on Black progress. The J.L. Nichols Company was based in Naperville, Illinois. But the credit for suggesting and planning what the company called a Negro history, which was a line of books on Negro history, went to an Atlanta employee whose small publishing company, the Nichols Company, had absorbed around 1896. According to a history of the Nichols Company, it was his suggestion that the company issued Progress of a Race, the publication of which introduced the company as what they called a race publisher. That the idea of a race publisher was conceptualized in Atlanta, Georgia, and orchestrated from Naperville, Illinois at the end of the 19th century points to the intersection of a number of things. The Nichols Company believed that a Black book buying public existed or could be cultivated by a book manufacturing company that sold books exclusively on a subscription basis. The success of this business, which experienced a surge in the late 19th century, depended on the publisher's ability to locate and tap into new or under-realized book buying publics. They sold books to people who had never bought them before, relying on a business model that was fundamentally unlike that of trade publishers to cover the vast expanse of the US that was not urban and lacked access to retail venues. Subscription publishers hired regional agents, who in turn hired canvassers who would then sell books door to door. The books they published were notorious for being rapidly produced and riddled with errors. But some, like the Nichols Company leadership, viewed these problems as irrelevant. You know that 9/10 of the people who buy subscription books are not very intelligent, that is to say, not very well read, wrote the head of the company in 1900. In a letter to Booker T. Washington's personal assistant, amidst negotiations to publish Booker T. Washington's first autobiography. In verbalizing the cynical belief that his clients were, by and large, a naive group, the Nichols Company revealed much about its marketing strategies, which sought to capitalize on both the inexperience of their clients as book buyers and their hunger for certain kinds of titles, as well as for the look and literary bulk and substance. So like most subscription books, Progress of Erase was sold from a prospectus, sometimes called the canvassing book or sales dummy, which was an abbreviated example of the book. Canvassers brought the sales dummies into Black communities, moving door to door and taking orders for the completed volume. It's worth noting that the sales dummy for Progress of Erase and books like it were not meant for textual appreciation. Rather, these dummies were visual documents, ones that agents were required to, for which agents were required to create the narrative arc from the pictures rather than the words that the words in order to sell it. There's no doubt that the images of the book expanded its potential readership beyond those who were literate in the most conventional sense. Agents were instructed to emphasize the fine pictures and repeatedly call attention to the book as the best illustrated work ever published. And I suspect that every sales dummy in this room right now, and there are a number on the table, all advertise themselves as illustrated and called on their agents to sell the book in that way. The agents were advised to read the title page aloud slowly and deliberately, and to always read the writing under the illustrations, bringing them to life verbally for those potential buyers without extensive literacy skills. So there's little information on the identities of the sales agents, and likewise, not much textual evidence on what the actual experience was between agent and potential buyer. Still, an elaborate set of selling tips for an early 20th century edition of Progress of Erase, which includes a script to be used by agents in selling the book, offers some tantalizing hints. And that document I found in this library. First of all, the script assumes both agents for the book and buyers are Black. Let me go back. Phrases like the people of our race and references to our people become refrains in the sales spiel, connecting seller and buyer in a shared racial identity and racial history that agents hoped would result in a commitment to buy. But agents were prepared to connect with customers in other ways as well. They were instructed to position themselves as known to other customers in the community by constructing and then capitalizing on an intersecting social network of potential buyers. Because the endorsement of a community's most prominent and well-respected members would give others confidence to buy the book, agents were told to call on them first. Conversations with one buyer would facilitate a relationship with the next. It's easy to find out about folks who live in nearby houses, agents were told. They were also directed to greet your customer pleasantly and by name if possible. All of these instructions served as reminders that communities were created and reinforced through the purchase of Progress of Erase. Agents broke down barriers of class, education, and vocation by advertising Progress of Erase as a book alike for laborer, mechanic, and the professional man, all of whom would find it interesting and instructive. More than anything else, agents were instructed to appeal to their potential buyers' burgeoning sense of race pride. Don't you agree that we ought to be proud of our people, Mr. Blank? Reads one suggested sales pitch. Another is this line: you will laugh, Mr. Blank, to learn how smart some of these slaves were. This one was shipped to safety in a box by freight. The stories highlighted by agents promise to entertain and educate, all while underscoring the centrality of African Americans, not only to the text itself, but also to American life. In 1898, this information was unavailable to African Americans in any formal school setting. Indeed, agents told prospective buyers, the information contained in this book will never appear in school histories. Owning Progress of a Race and books like it became a collective educational endeavor and responsibility. As I have argued, it was a book that was bought and consulted as a course of study outside of the standard curriculum Black people found at schools or in the educational programs that were open to them. It is our duty, agents told buyers, to see that folks know what a wonderful record the race has made in these few short years. You can do your share by reading this book, letting your children learn the truth, and giving the facts as wide a distribution as possible. In this context, the phrase, a copy of Progress of a Race in every house, was not merely a sales slogan. It reflected the belief that the text was an essential way of transmitting knowledge that would be crucial to reimagining African-American identity and life. So let me close by moving you quickly to the end of the sales process, where buyers were told the exact page count of Progress of a Race. And that page count was over 600 in the 1898 edition. And you'll see that even in the copy that I'm showing right now, 600 was what was told, but the agent or the publisher had written in I think it's 663 or 665. I think it's 663 because that's the exact page count. The sales process, in the sales process, the agent also showed the two possible bindings for the book. The first, bound in beautiful silk cloth, which was being offered for $1.55, and the second, more expensive option, bound in beautiful red Russian cloth, gilt edges, and stamped on the back in gold. And this binding brought the book to $2.25. And anyone is familiar with these sales dummies, one of the ways that they were able to show the two bindings was by putting a sample of the spine of the alternative binding in the book itself. So you see, it looks like a bookmark, but in fact, it's an example of the spine of the red Russian, the more expensive of the bindings. At the back of each prospectus was a columned ruled grid on which information on the order was to be recorded. It's an irony of print history that these pages were also the most disposable. They were likely submitted to the publisher as soon as the blanks were filled so that the orders could be fulfilled. So they were in most sales dummy, they're either blank like this one, or the ones that were relevant were ripped out of the book literally and turned in, or the book in its entirety was turned in. The absence of these pages limits what we can know about the readership of the book, the choices buyers made in terms of the preferred binding, and the rate and pace of sales. The few sales dummies that sometimes include, a few sales dummies sometimes include a name or two. But more often, the sales dummies that remain bear the marks of their reuse for general note-taking, for instance, or as a place to practice handwriting, like this one, or mathematical figures. And the sales dummy from which that comes from is here in the room right now. So we're left to gauge the success of Progress of a Race from the Nichols Company's observations in its history that this book, and for them, the whole venture into race publishing generally, was what they called a great success. They continued to publish Progress of a Race, which appeared in at least 5 editions between 1898 and 1929. More importantly, they continued to seek out texts by Black authors to sell by subscription. By far their most prominent, but also their most problematic author was Booker T. Washington, whose Story of My Life and Work the Nichols Company published in 1900. Washington's efforts to manipulate the Nichols Company and the ways that the Nichols Company and other subscription publishers manipulated him as he struggled to find his footing as a literary commodity forms another chapter of my work in To Make Negro Literature. So the title of my talk today refers to an 1898 article in Publishers Weekly that described the publishing the subscription publishing industry as composed of unscrupulous publishers whose modern literary productions are utterly worthless. The story I've quickly constructed here suggests that for scholars of African American literary history, this stereotype has outlasted its usefulness. By dismissing books sold by subscription, we have closed off one avenue through which to expand our knowledge of those Black Americans whose access to reading material was limited to the unexceptional and pedagogically oriented. In drawing attention to books sold by subscription, one of the things I'm advocating for is that we remain conscious of the still limited kinds of work that receive our attention. At the time of this writing, Black print culture studies has never been more vibrant or more plentiful. But if we are to create a more nuanced and more detailed history of African American literary culture, we still need to expand the scope of literary studies, as well as our understanding of its appropriate objects of attention. Thank you.
Okay, so the floor is open for questions, and if you have a question on Zoom, stand by. Okay, Liliana.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I'm working primarily with German material, so I apologize for relying on that. In the 19th century, we have two very discrete models of pedagogy here. One is the model of what would be education or Erziehung. That means the acquisition of information or knowledge from the outside. We might say today maybe instrumentalized or how it is useful to become a good businessman or whatever.
Yeah.
The other model is the model of Bildung. And the idea of Bildung comes from biology, the development of a plant from the seed to full flower. And the idea that the human being is very similar, so that whatever it receives from the outside as information is actually there not as the information per se, but to encourage the development to become more oneself. And in terms of the rise of the bourgeoisie, they identify with Bildung. Now, it seems to me that listening to the subscription libraries, that two different ways that I want to sort out of it, or maybe you can help me with this. On the one hand, I have the feeling that there is a sense of pride that the reader has to become more conscious of one's history and who one is, and become more consciously a Black person. On the other hand, it is information given, how to navigate in the world. How does that relate? The word progress may tend towards Bildung, but some other of the information does not. What is the agenda there?
So it's so interesting to hear you talk about the sort of two directions, because in some ways, if you look at subscription publishing wasn't only this kind of book. And one of the things it was more than anything else, particularly as it traveled into the Midwest and the agricultural regions, was literally instructions. So instructions on whether it was agriculture or business, how to do things. And so in some ways, it seems to me that one of the things that I would argue that I see happening, certainly in the books I'm looking at, and I wouldn't be surprised if it is something that happens around the turn of the century across books published by subscription, is that they do seem to bridge these two functions. And so they remain, their roots as instruction. What comes from those is that you need essentially useful knowledge, and that the advantage of the subscription book was often, and it was often advertised this way, that it took the contents of like 7 other books and put them in one book. right? And it did so less expensively and more directly. So that it seems to me is one aspect of subscription publishing that remains, at least it remains in the books that I've looked at. They just chop things up in order to condense them and make them accessible at a price point that works for their buyers. The other side is that what I saw in these books was that they participated in another thing that's happening, which is the division between a very functional idea of literacy, which at least in the United States, in part comes out of right at the end of the 19th century, the education of freed freed slaves, and the difference between basic literacy and this emerging concept of the literary. So it seems to me that the emergent concept of literary is all about intellectual thought, and it's all about it's part and parcel of the way that the American university is becoming more specialized and dividing up into, literary study is no longer going to be elocution and sort of recitation. It's going to be what we now think of as literary study much more. So I think that these books, in some sense, one way to think of it is they're at a bit of an identity crisis moment at the end of the 19th century, and so in fact, what you're identifying, that split, I think, is very much a part of the fabric of the book, as is. Again, I mean, the way that the American university is becoming more like the German university.
Thanks so much for this. Kind of thinking about your project as a whole, right, and this is one piece of it. You said that part of the reason that texts like this are disregarded is because they're hard to name and they're hard to categorize, right? And you have another chapter in the book which is all about categories, which is about turn of the century Black bibliography, which are really projects about, what would be the categories of Black authorship, right, or of Negro literature, right? So I was wondering, if you took inspiration from those list makers, right, that are part of your book, like what would be some of the new landmarks or categories that you would propose for rethinking this moment in Black literary studies, so that the field stops missing, right, these disregarded objects? What are your categories?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I mean, one thing I would argue is that I think we need to. Let me start by saying, one of the prime things we need to do is learn from, but not be bound by, the fact that the riches of the Northeast, right, and the riches of like literary culture in the Northeast. And with that comes, the expectations of a certain kind of literary culture and also a certain class of readers. And for me, that has just made it possible for us to sort of ignore what is in reality a far wider and more varied set of texts, but also of formats. So, for instance, in the South, there's a whole tradition, weird, because so unfamiliar and very hard to trace, but of things like broadsides, where even writers from the North would go down into the South and distribute these single sheet productions, right, that were far less expensive than books. And so we associate broadsides, or I do at least, with the Revolutionary War. I mean, I think of that for me was when I don't know whether that's when I started thinking about broadsides, but I mean, broadsides have such a single sheet publication and such a rich history, and yet, of course, this would be my point of paralysis. Like, well, how the heck would you start looking for single sheets that have disintegrated? So I think, part of it is to think about, unpublished books is one of the things that I talk about in the book, and that I think is, a huge area that we have just disregarded. And again, what's the difference between, in the book I read about Mary Church Terrell, who has tons and tons and tons of short stories, for instance, that are unpublished. But how would you distinguish that between, like, the short stories that I wrote when I was 7 that really have no business being, the subject of literary study? So, I mean, I think, a lot of these are questions, they're questions less of like the kinds of material, but maybe more of what we do with them. Like, what are we looking for? And what counts? And how do we, I don't know, in some ways, so much of my work has been like, how do you come at questions, through a back door, because there is no front door. So the questions maybe are, well, what are the back doors that we need to attend to see more deeply? And that's, that's especially true, I think, in Black, with Black subjects, because things weren't published. They didn't reach points of recognition and notoriety. But that doesn't mean they were any less part of what was, there.
Just want to remind everyone on Zoom, if you have a question you want to ask, you can use the raise hand function. And I don't know if I'm asking it up there, but why don't we go to a question from there?
Yeah, a question in the chat. How does Friedman's Torchlight compare to Webster's Blueback Speller in its approach to literacy? I'm intrigued by Friedman's Torchlight's intersection of a school book usually structured by levels of difficulty with the periodicity of a periodical.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, one way I found my way to Friedman's Torchlight was, oh, thank you.
Go ahead. I'm just gonna
was because I actually was looking at accounts of the Webster's Blueback Speller, and the ways that it was written about, mostly in narratives from the WEPA projects, where people look back on how they had learned to read. And one of the ways that people learned to read was by tucking, books into their hats and, little scraps of newspaper. And they would write about, there's one line that I just remember clearly, at the end of the row, of working in the field, they would stop and have a lesson, like do a lesson. And so that idea of education that happens outside of a formal institution, and the way that had been a tradition, made me start looking at some of those other sources. I mean, Pennington's book is called a textbook, but even more so, the way that these books, even if they weren't called a textbook, operated in that way. Now, Friedman's Torchlight is a really interesting paper. Now, one thing we don't have is we don't have other issues. So it's hard to know how that would have looked over time. But that issue is like tucked into all these other sort of manuals on reading that were produced by different people. I mean, it's like, I don't even know how I found it. Actually, I see Ellen Gruber-Garvey out there, and I just remember I had coffee with her, and I was saying that I had just found this thing, and we ended up talking about Friedman's Torchlight for most of the time. But it's interesting the way that it does suggest that learning could be, delivered over time, right? That literacy could be acquired both in the context, literally, of a newspaper, if moving from page 1 to page 4, but also, in lessons that would come, that you're not ready for this lesson yet, but that lesson will come in future issues of the paper. And so it would be interesting to go back and see if there are other, I mean, in essence, it's sort of like volumes of a school book, Spanish 1, Spanish 2, Spanish 3. But it'd be interesting to go back and see, other like clear signs of that kind of periodical sequencing.
First of all, thank you so much. This is a really fascinating talk. I have a question, kind of going off the question of categories about a race progress, and about how it absorbs and reprints other materials.
Yeah.
And so first, when you brought up the instructions for the agents, I noticed that some chapters were clearly written for this kind of as an encyclopedia, but then it also names authors as, you know, talking about a chapter on religion or reprinting a speech. So the first question is, did you find that they would ever like commission pieces or reach out to a specific author that they know that, you know, someone might recognize the name and that would be intriguing? Or if it was usually readily printings. But my larger question is sort of as like a scrapbook miscellany, did you find that there was vast changes in tone, or if the publishing company had
Like smooth that out.
had to smooth that out or try to have one specific style come through all of these different
Yeah.
kinds of writing?
Yeah, so I said I would come back to the question of authorship, which is like super vexed in these books. So some of them have a much clearer sense of who the author is, and some books sold by subscription, you know, you can tell that it's sort of discrete units of text that come from one writer, even if they're not sort of attributed. With Progress of Race, it's sort of in some ways a different beast, in part because you can go through and identify, and I did. I mean, that was one of my rabbit holes, I was like, oh my God, this comes from here, this comes from there. And it's all kinds of books. It's some of it is publications that emerged from, or speeches that were given at, for instance, the Negro building in 1895. Some of it is other African-American books sold by subscription. A lot of it is like German thinkers. And I mean, it's all over the place. So I did spend a lot of time like identifying everything. And there are probably pages and pages written where I'm like, look, here's this, look, here's there. But that, like, very quickly it became apparent to me that that was not the point. But I can answer you very directly that no, they do not smooth it out at all. It's like they just, you know, say something from this person and they move on to another person. Now, in the preface, they refer to essays, pieces that have been requested but did not reach us in time. So they clearly did some requesting, or apparently did some requesting, but much of it is not requestable. In other words, it's like pieces of books that they've just taken. And most of the time, except for references to like Dr. Livingstone, they don't say who it's from. There are two really interesting, there's one not exception and then there's one exception. The not exception is, at one point they cite an entire speech by Booker T. Washington, and they don't attribute it to Booker T. Washington, which at that moment is like kind of, it's kind of audacious, you know, and they break it up and they, you know, take out things they don't want and stuff like that. But basically it's Booker T. Washington's speech. And it is part of this section where they're sort of debating, you know, the material presents different perspectives on Black education. What I took from that is that in some ways they wanted the opinion, but they didn't want the weight of the name associated with it. So, but then the other example is where they cite from Alexander Crummell, who's like this towering intellectual. He's just seconds ago died, and they cite an entire article. They don't take anything out. All they do is post not section breaks. They post subheadings on each paragraph that literally, you know, in one word summarize what the paragraph's about. And it's almost as if, you know, like a towering intellectual like Alexander Crummell, he deserves his name on the piece. And Booker T. Washington's a lot more problematic in terms of like identifying him, even though he writes the introduction for this book as well. You asked me one other question at the very beginning, but I think I might have, yeah.
Well, it is fascinating. Sorry, just that we also then present it sort of as a book that's an entire library in itself. that you might
Exactly.
pick up and put down rather than read later.
Exactly. And that's, I mean, that's basically, my argument is that the point was to offer as much reading material as it could. And what is woven, so the authors don't change the writing. What they do is they editorialize, like they add editorial comments that talks you through the writing, that offers like the context for the writing. So like, one of the preposterous ideas, I can't even remember what, they're so preposterous, but Black people aren't, they come from animals, not people. And they're like, this is ridiculous. And then they say, look how ridiculous it is. And they include it, but it's so, it is done such a way that it completely discounts what's said. So it deserves being recognized as in like seen, but it does not deserve recognition in some sense.
Yeah, should we, Marcy, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure, thanks. As always with your work, I learned so much, so thank you. And I have, I think, a question that might help us knit together some of the previous questions and some of your responses too. As you were speaking, I couldn't help thinking, what if we switched from questions of format or foregrounding format to questions of genre? And thought about how these texts might relate to some of the genres familiar from especially pedagogy, like grammars, digests, miscellanies, and especially encyclopedias. And I have the unfair advantage of being able to do a quick search. And I looked up for the Freedman's Torchlight, if section 4 on prosody, if that was true of Murray's grammar, and it turns out section 4 of Murray's grammar is in fact prosody.
Yes.
It seems like they might be modeling from Murray in that case. And so I was thinking for the progress of the race and also the Negro building, that the encyclopedia is, I think, a pretty interesting connection to think about as a possibility genre-wise, and just wondered if you had thoughts in that direction. Thanks.
So I had thoughts about what genre these were for, the entire time I was working with these books. And I still, I settled on school books in part because I found this context that seemed that for me worked with the way that they were sort of didactic, pedagogically logical. But I think, encyclopedia is absolutely accurate as well. And there's one book that I've worked with that is called the Afro-American Encyclopedia. And it's a much more complete book, but I think that that's what these books were going for. They were going for encyclopedic snippets, encyclopedic knowledge, but for, a normal person, not for someone who was embedded in, Northeast literary culture. So not for someone who went to the Bethel literary meeting every other week and, debated with Booker T. Washington. But I think in some ways, part of what the intent of the book was to, it goes back to this idea of planting a seed, planting a seed for this desire for this kind of knowledge, right? For this breadth of knowledge, for this, when I say depth of knowledge, the books did not offer depth of knowledge, but I do think that they suggested depth of knowledge. So I think, if I went back over this and I feel like whether I could get to a better definition or better genre that we know of to attach to these, I don't know, but I will say at some point I also started thinking, well, why am I attaching this to a genre that we already know, that we identify with? And it almost seemed like it was equally, if not more accurate, to sort of let these books sit as, their own genre, or a genre that we don't think of, quite honestly, in literary terms, because I think that's the other, not that we think of encyclopedias in that way now, but in some sense, it seemed to me that in some ways, these books are fundamentally outside of those genres that we want to identify them with, including, I would argue, some of the like commonplace books, some of the genres I associate with British literature, that I think these just aren't. They are akin to them, but they are not, they are not them.
Sure. Thank you, Elizabeth. This was really wonderful, and I've learned so much. I have just two questions, really more factual. One is about the Negro building and whether we know who visited the Negro building and whether white people came into the Negro building or were engaged in discussion. And my other question is about H.F. Pletzik.
Oh, good. Yeah. Yeah.
Who was he and what was his role in shaping the book?
So let me start with the last thing, because I promised. So Progress of Race bears the name of two authors. They call themselves authors, even though we've talked about the kinds of things that make a huge question mark over what they meant by authorship and what they meant by themselves as authors. The other author is Henry Frick Kleitzing, unclear. He was on the faculty at Northwestern College, which is in Naperville, Illinois. The faculty was only 10 people at the time. And another member of the faculty was the person who founded the Nichols Company. So my sense, and this held me up too. My sense is that Kleitzing was put on as an added name, and in that a white name. Like, in other words, he had no renown. I mean, he is a publisher of a couple other books, one with his brother, kind of religious books. I mean, there's nothing that I found that distinguished him. But I think that there was some sense of one of two things, or both. One, that the book would carry greater authority if it had, a sort of white co-author. And two, that the book would carry a sense of interracial harmony if it carried the name of a white author. I don't think that he had anything substantively to do with this book, but I don't know that. And so I made a decision at some point to not only talk about Krogman. So in the book, I do talk about, I talk about Kleitzing, but more importantly, I refer to them, as a plural. I don't know who made the kinds of editorial decisions. I don't know, I have no evidence that Kleitzing and Krogman had any sort of substantive association. But, that's one of there's so many mysteries that remain about these books.
The sales pitch is so clearly to African Americans and excluding the possibility of a white audience.
It doesn't give any suggestion that there was a substantial, if any, effort to market it in white communities. But I still stand by, that maybe Kleitzing was put on the volume in order to possibly make that. One thing we can acknowledge is that this book literally was a first. It was their experiment. So, what it took to sell it, I think that they were sort of feeling they were way along. I don't think there was any, model for how to do this. So the Negro building, I wish I could remember it because I'm going to mess up the exact figures. But on the day the Negro building opened, there was a big address. And the numbers that we have for that day, there were something like, some incredible number of African Americans, like 5,000. And there were more like 100 white people. So there were white visitors to the Negro building. We know that because there are white people who write about the Negro building at the time. Like, they write reviews of it. They talk about the controversies with it and stuff like that. But I think we can't underestimate the fact that Black people came a lot from the North down to see the Negro building specifically. And there were huge problems, as you can imagine, because they had to stay in Black owned rooming places. They had to eat in segregated restaurants. It was, all these questions swirled around the Negro building, making it, even in the success of having a dedicated space, very much a vexed, site. But I'd have to go back to look at the exact numbers.
Let's go to Ellen Garvey on the Zoom, and then we'll come back into the room, and then John Gers. We have a lot of questions. I know you have
Okay.
a train to catch, so we'll try to ask your questions as briefly as you can. Go ahead, Ellen.
I thought I heard my name. I don't know if I did.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just, this is a wonderful, fascinating talk, and I'm desperate to get your book. But I'm just wondering about this volume and the setting and buying of the book, and wondering how it intersects with traditions of encyclopedia buying. And there's so many stories and memoirs of working class parents saving to buy the set of encyclopedias that they've been persuaded will boost their kids' chances in life, or that will, be a treasure for the household. And I wondered if you had accounts from people who used the book, or grew up using these books, or any kind of records of people reading it.
I have literally no records of anyone reading it. It is, there's no writing about it. There's no, I have not come across anyone who wrote about it, like in retrospect, oh, I remember, my beat up old copy of Progress of a Race. I think,
It's amazing, 5 editions, that's still enough. You said 5 editions.
Oh, I have not looked at, I actually think if you were to look at later issues of this book, you might have a totally different experience. That was not in my purview. So in the book, what happens to the book? I mean, I know what happens to the book a little bit after I write about it, but the 1829 volume, I don't, that's for someone else to look at. What we have is every once in a while, there's a sales dummy that has a name in the back, or, and I've gone down that path of sort of looking, but it's, it's not very, there's not a lot. And it's very hard to, trace out how, as I said, how the sales experience was from the other side, what the relationship was between the agents and the readers, and how this book was practically used. So my reading of it is based on trying to determine a book that sold very, very well, how what its context was, how it might have been used. But I cannot, I don't have any proof that I'm right.
Thank you so much for that. At the beginning, you made a point to distinguish between hidden and disregarded material. And I was wondering if you could sort of describe the terms of that distinction a little more, and then also explain sort of how that distinction plays out with your archival work, your approach to the peer review work, and also how it bears out how you're framing the internet.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one way to look at hidden is as part of a collection that hasn't been cataloged. So that would be, sort of an official way to think about it. Disregarded is, for instance, a book that, I mean, in the case of these books, when I first saw them, and this I think speaks to, the wealth of Harvard University. I mean, all these books are just on the shelf. And whether they've been pulled now, I mean, I actually suspect they're still on the shelf. So I think that it's not that we didn't know about these books. I mean, Henry Louis Gates writes about these books in the landmark article on the New Negro. But what he says about these books is, that they were part of this sort of reimagining of Blackness at the turn of the century. I totally agree with that. But I think that in some real sense, most of what has been written about these books hasn't, sort of sussed out the fabric of them, right? And we were just joking before we started here that it's one thing to be fascinated by the subscription selling process, which I am, but it's another thing to figure out what the books are doing, right? To figure out what the contents of the books are. And I think that basically we have been content to be fascinated with the process, but we haven't taken on the books. So for me, that is critical disregard, right? And I think these are the very books against which we judge books that we consider literature. So, so in some sense, what I'm trying to do, this gets to the substance of your question. What I'm trying to do is not to say Progress Over Race should be considered literature as we consider literature. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say, if we are to take seriously our desire to reconstruct, to know the contours of African-American literary history, then we can't be content to only look at those things that we recognize. And we can't be content to only look at those things that readily give themselves to a narrative, right? Fit into the narratives we already know. This comes back to what Ellen's asking. We also can't only talk about the text that we can prove, that the story, right? We have to speculate. And this is, I mean, we're people of my generation are lucky enough that people like Carla Peterson and Frances Smith Foster came along and they told us it's okay to speculate, right? And so, and hopefully taught us how to do it in a responsible way, where we simply open up questions about these books and hopefully open up avenues through which other scholars will find more, right? And be able to talk even with greater, surety about what happened. So I feel like this is like, once again, what I hope this book is an invitation to other scholars to come along and look at these materials anew, and that by doing so, they will have a greater understanding of, for instance, not just the kinds of publishing that existed outside of the urban North and outside of relatively wealthy or middle and upper class readers, but also what we call the masses. I mean, these huge numbers of readers across the South and in the Midwest and other places that didn't have access to bookstores. I also hope that people will think of authorship in more complex ways, right? And explore things further, like the kinds of weird authorship that we don't recognize, and that we think we recognize. Like, for instance, I talk about Booker T. Washington's not writing what he, the books that are published under his name. So it's all well and good to be like, oh yeah, Booker T. Washington had ghostwriters, but to actually feel out what that means and to figure out what it meant to write for Booker T. Washington, and how that process of him, jotting down ideas and it becoming a book, how that worked. So I think that's what I'm getting at.
Okay, let's take one more question. John, do you want to unmute John Garcia?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'm really interested in getting hold of a copy as well. I just want to ask, because I know we're towards the end of time, just quickly about mobility. Just two things quickly. I'm curious if you found much evidence of African-American book agents. It's something I've been wondering about for a while. If I think about the only text that I think of that might be relevant here is William Still's The Underground Railroad, which is also sold by subscription. And I have, I've always wondered if maybe somebody like Still may have sought out a Black agent. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. And then secondly, on mobility, the title page of Progress Over Race also has, I believe, Canada. So I'm curious if you have any insights about maybe the possibility that these texts may have circulated outside of the US.
Let me answer the last one first. So the Nichols Company, subscription publishing thrived in Chicago in part because of its location and its ability to move books both south, west, and up to Canada, up as far as Canada. So the Nichols Company, in the same way that they had sort of absorbed this tiny little Atlanta publishing company. They clearly worked in Canada, but I don't have any sense of the book going to Canada. That might be a good thing, to pick up and look for. I definitely have a sense though that subscription publishing made Canada possible, let's just say. So that's a really interesting thing. The first thing was about, sorry. Black Book Agents. Okay. So, so the best account of William Still's experience with subscription publishing is by, oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name. It's not by me, though I do write about it in my book. And it is a model of subscription publishing. And my understanding is, so Still bought the plates for his book. So it had one history as sold by subscription by a publisher, and then he had it printed with his own plates. And so he did have Black agents selling the book. And we know a lot more about William Still than we do certainly about Progress of a Race and any of the books that I looked at. I think you have some of that. Is that some of that material I think is here? Is it Temple? Yeah. I'm not the William Still authority, but that narrative has definitely been told. But Laura, do you remember the name of that book? It's about African American history writing.
Oh, yeah.
You know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, Stephen Hall.
Stephen Hall. Yeah, Stephen Hall does a great job of writing about it. He has a whole chapter on it. And it's really, really informative and helpful.
Well, thank you so much. This was a really generative talk, and I'm sure we have many more. I have like 10 more questions, but you're got to get back to New York tonight. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thanks.